Greetings, Namaskar. Welcome to CEC lecture. The topic for the lecture today is Political Communication, Evolution and Transformation. In this lecture, we shall understand the meaning and nature of communication. Then we shall be having discussion on political communication as a specific case study, and then elaborate on the big picture, that is evolution and transformation of communication. The lecture shall be of great use for learners keen on political leadership and communication, keen on learning new insights in political science, communications, mass media, public policy, amongst others. Because communication has an important bearing on all disciplines. So, once again, the focus of the lecture, political communication, evolution and transformation, wherein we will be first looking at the meaning and nature of communication, specifically look at political communication, and then map down the evolution and transformation of communication through the lens of history. Let us ask ourselves, what do we mean by communication? Or to say, how do we define communication? Communication, in simple terms, it is sum of all the things that one person does when he wants to create understanding in the mind of the other. Lewis A. Allen rightly points out that communication signifies sum of all things one person does when he wants to create understanding in the mind of another. Communication, dear learners, involves a systematic and continuous process of telling, listening and understanding. So, once again, this very discussion tells us that how communication is multifaceted. It involves multiple processes. So, herein when we talk about the process of telling, listening and understanding, this also tells us that communications is a very systematic process. Moving forward, very popularly it is defined that communication, it is the process through which two or more persons come to exchange ideas and understanding amongst themselves. So, this very definition of communication, that is the process through which two or more persons come to exchange ideas and understanding amongst themselves, tells us that communication as a process indeed needs to tap in the dimensions of number of people involved, what is the idea, how to factor in understanding. Communication is also popularly defined as process of transmitting and receiving verbal and non-verbal messages that produce a response. So, with this very definition, that communication is the process of transmitting and receiving verbal and non-verbal messages that produce a response, tells us that communication can take place through the verbal ways as well as through the non-verbal message. And the very important aspect, that is looking at the response. Communications, therefore, when we look at it from the big picture of effectiveness, communications is considered effective when it achieves the desired reaction or response from the receiver. So, once again, communication, when we see it from the point of view that it is the point of or the process of transmitting and receiving verbal and non-verbal messages that produce a response. So, therefore, when we map it on the scale of effectiveness, communications is considered effective when it achieves the desired reaction or response from the receiver. Moving forward, this discussion on the definition of communication explains to us that communications is a two-way process of exchanging ideas or information between human beings. And again, as we are discussing communication, we must underline that communication is an essential feature of human existence. Hence, when we try to understand communication, we must understand that communication is very vital for human existence, and this is why also we must look at it communications in the big framework, that it is a two-way process of exchanging ideas or information between human beings. Communications, generally, it's a two-way process. Communications, as we have just been seeing from the ongoing discussion, communication involves stimulus and response amongst organisms. Communications involves both sending and receiving information. Further, we must understand that communication is very significant. Communications is found in all organizations irrespective of size and nature. So, communication as a two-way process, it involves a stimulus and response amongst organisms. It involves both sending and receiving information, and it is found in all organizations irrespective of size and nature. From this ongoing discussion, we also get that communication is related to human activity, and therefore, what its significance is huge. Communications is the basis for effective implementation of plans. Communications helps us in carrying out directions. Communications is significant for execution of activities. So, therefore, communications has a huge significance in the world at large. But then let us decode the specific aspect of political communication. So, then let us decode what is political. So, when we talk about what is political, long ago, the Greek political philosopher Aristotle argued humans were political animals. So, politics, as we all know, it means different things to different people. So, and when we say and recall, as Aristotle says, human beings as political animal, or that politics connotes different things to different people and different times. So, therefore, political in the word political communication demands a deeper analysis, because the idea of political is very significant for human beings, then politics is pervasive. So, therein one has to map down how do ideas flow, how does information circulate, and all this can be done if we have a good sense of understanding of political leadership as well as communication. As we decode what is political or understand politics, Harold Laswell defined politics as who gets what, when, how. Harold Laswell's definition of politics as to who gets what, when and how, it's very important because this gives us the sense, that is, how do we map down the role of communication in understanding the process of who gets what, when and how. We must have also a look at the important work by Harold Dwight Laswell, Politics, Who Gets When, Who Gets What, When and How, a very important book, and in this definition that we get of politics, that is, who gets what, when and how, mapping communications becomes very important. So, this is why it becomes significant to understand the role of communications within the various dynamics of politics, namely, as we take the definition of Harold Laswell, who gets what, when and how. Because in all these processes, many people, many aspects of society and polity and economy are involved. So, therefore, communications is very important. Understanding communication becomes very significant to decode the political, to understand the politics, and above all, understand the dynamics of who gets what, when and how. Now, with this, as we understand politics, the word politics too has different interpretations. To some people, it may signify power struggle between people or groups. To some, it may also mean the execution part, namely exercise of power. So, when we are trying to decode political, these multiple interpretations about politics, namely power struggle between people or groups, or as exercise of power, also demands that we must understand the dynamic nature, the pervasive impact and influence of communication. David Easton defined politics as authoritative allocation of values. Aristotle called politics as master science. Now, with all these important reflections from David Easton defining politics as authoritative allocation of values, Aristotle calling politics as master science, all these things underline, tell that how important is it to factor in the role of communication, how and where allocation is made, how are values formed. In understanding of all these things, political communication plays an important role, and this is why communication is vital for human existence. As we decode political, the idea of political, the perspective of Max Weber is also very important to understand. Max Weber defines the state as the form of human community that successfully lays claim to the monopoly of legitimate physical violence within a particular territory. So, this idea of Weber, with reference to when we look at the concept of politics too, has some important implications. For Max Weber, politics can be defined as striving to share power or influence, the distribution of power between different states or people within a state. So, in this perspective of Max Weber, looking at politics, that is, how do we look at power or influence in the big picture of distribution of power between different states or people within a state. So, one can say from this ongoing discussion that politics, idea of political and communication are deeply linked. So, therefore, one must keep understanding the intricacies, the dynamics involved in politics, idea of political and the bigger implication for political leadership and communications. With this, dear friends, when we talk about communications, like human beings, communications too has had a specific pattern of evolution and transformation. Communications has changed with time. Medium, means and formats of communications have evolved with time. So let us look at some important remarks from history in order to understand the picture of evolution and transformation of communications. When we look at the bylanes of history, in the prehistoric times, and when we look at prehistoric communications, oral traditions, storytelling find an important place in remarks of various historians in order to understand means and mediums of communication. In the prehistoric communication phase, wherein oral traditions, storytelling were important, at this phase, human beings were involved in food gathering, hunting. This was this important stage of human evolution. And with this, later, symbols were developed. Figurative cave paintings as evidences are there in various historical accounts. So, from oral traditions, storytelling to figurative cave painting evidences tell us that how even in the prehistoric times, communications had an important place. Further, when we try to look at remarks from history, later we find that there was the use of petroglyphs, that is carvings into a rock surface. So, when we look at petroglyphs, drawing or carving on rock or stone, the symbolic images sculpted or engraved on the surface of rocks by removing material from its surface layer with instruments of superior hardness. Later, with time, as human evolution was also taking place, communication too kept pace with transformations. So, what we see here is there is rise of use of pictograms. Pictograms, they are symbols that convey meaning through its resemblance to a physical object. When we try to look at this evolution, for example, in context of today's understanding, we have charts that use images or symbols to represent data. Pictogram later then evolved into ideograms. So, again, as we look at contemporary times too, pictograms and cartograms, they are very useful tools for visual representation of data. So, what we see here is that communications, as human being civilization was evolving, as we move from prehistoric ages, also witnessed changes. Later, one finds remarks about the use of cuneiform, that is large symbolic writing system, and it is often argued that this was one of the earliest writing systems. When we look at how ancient Mesopotamian, the Persian form of writing in which the wooden sticks with triangular ends are pressed into wet clay. So, all this tells us that how cuneiform, all of this becomes significant in this journey of evolution and transformation of communication. The word cuneiform comes from the Latin word meaning wedge. This style of writing used a wedge shaped stylus to make impressions on primarily clay. Later, as time moved by, one finds that there was the rise of or important reference to in the works of various historians on the use of Egyptian hieroglyphics. Although hieroglyphics are Egyptian, the word hieroglyphics is Greek. Hiero means holy. Glyphics means marks or writing. So, the word signifies holy writings. So, hieroglyphic writing system that employed characters in the form of pictures. Further, as we look at various other resources also, There are remarks by historians and in various works of history on how ancient Egyptians invented some of the earliest known writing systems, and the symbols they used were called hieroglyphs. Further, with time, as we see that things are changing, communication too witnessed changes, and one witnesses the rise of Phoenician alphabet. Now, this was a real improvement when we look at contemporary syllabic writing systems. And when you look at Phoenician alphabet, they are the prototype for all alphabets in the world. Further, with time there was a focus on or the use of the quill pens. They evolved into popular writing tool during the Middle Ages. Further, there are important references from history that tell us that when we look at important documents like Magna Carta 1215, Declaration of Independence 1776, it was the quill pens they were used to sign these important documents. So again what we see that it is important to note that for the evolution of communication, that is evolution of the tools, the writing tools, the mediums, the formats, this journey of evolution has been slow but steady. Another important role in this evolution and transformation of communication can also be seen in the work of Petraș Poinarau, the Romanian inventor, engineer, mathematician who invented the world's first fountain pen, an invention for which the French government also issued a patent. Further, when we look at this evolution of the mediums, of the means of communication, the work of Louis Waterman in 1884, who revolutionized fountain pen technology by introducing the capillary feed system, invented the modern fountain pen. There are various works of history that also point out that how the Chinese developed wooden block movable type printing. And of course, when we look at the evolution of communication, the important incident from history, that is the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in 1450. Now, Johannes Gutenberg, the German craftsman and inventor, in this important invention, that is the very aspect of movable type printing press, which started the printing revolution. The printing press, it's a device that allowed for mass production. Now, with this focus on the masses, information revolution occurred, and herein the role of mediums and formats of communication and their evolution indeed is very significant. So, once again when we look at evolution and transformation of communication, in this aspect there has been survival as well as progress, and this is why scholars have rightly said that communications is a process in which people share information, ideas and feelings. And when we look at the bylanes of history, the inventions in the history tell us that communication innovations have been marked by focus on the survival instinct as well as keeping pace with the progress. Further, when we look at the evolution and transformation of communication, we must also look at the telegraph, and an important work by Charles F. Briggs and Augustine Maverick, who wrote in their 1858 book, The Story of the Telegraph, and we quote, "Of all the marvelous achievements of modern science, the electric telegraph is transcendently the greatest and most serviceable to mankind. The whole earth will be belted with the electric content with human thoughts and emotions." And this also tells us that when we look at the idea behind the telegraph, that is sending electric signals with wires. Yes, sending electric signals with wires, and therein that was the important work of Professor Samuel Morse. So again what we see here is that politics and business were no longer constrained by geography now. It was easy now because information made it possible. The means of communication have witnessed evolution as well as diversification. So when we map down the evolution and transformation of communication, indeed things have come a long way from communication via sounds, gestures, drawings on the grounds or the cave wall to the bigger use of printing press, to telegraph, amongst others. And all of this becomes important to understand, to map down, to tell us the important role of communication in evolution of human civilization. Dear learners, we hope that you all gained important insights from the lecture. We look forward to positive, encouraging feedback from you all. Thank you very much.